There is an extraordinary disorientation among people who are not students of this work, whereby they think the word decolonial means one thing, where it's actually a word with a number of different meanings. And they also tend to think that the word decolonial is at one and the same time postcolonialism, decoloniality, whereas each one of these systems, as I'm trying to suggest, has got quite specific ways of diagnosing the problems the world faces today and also offering specific kind of remedies as to how one should go about decolonizing. I want to distinguish when one talks about decolonial between a broad and a narrow meaning of decolonial. So I'm going to start with the broad one. Because in the kind of popular discourse, in everyday conversation, or in the vernacular, when people say decolonial, they are using it as a kind of all purpose adjective to refer to anything that is in pursuit of decolonization. So all forms of intellectual decolonization are on that reading decolonial. All of the different writers that I mentioned from Africa are decolonial writers. Any practice or theory that aims to grapple with decolonization would become decolonial. So that's the broad meaning of decolonial, and I can see why that term has become popular. But I think that there's an equivocation that takes place by the decoloniality theorists because the narrow meaning of decolonial is that it is an adjective which is referring to a specific kind of theoretical apparatus, which is called decoloniality theory, and which has its own unique lineage, its own genesis in Latin America in debates in the 1980s, its own unique conceptual apparatus, its own unique vocabulary and language for both making sense of history, but also proposing how one should go about treating problems of injustice today. And so what happens is that when the word decolonial comes to refer to both everything that is in pursuit of decolonization and this highly specific, narrow kind of theoretical apparatus, it creates an extraordinary confusion, and it allows decoloniality theorists to pretend as though their approach is one and the same with all of the approaches of intellectual decolonization. That's not the case, and I'm going to show you why that's the case right now. Decoloniality theory can be traced back to a series of debates that were taking place in the 1980s in Latin America, and it was emerging out of debates that were taking place between dependency theorists, Marxists, world systems analysts, and it was being pioneered by a research group called MCD, or in English, the Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality Research Group. Figures which are closely associated with this decoloniality theory include the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who I think could be said to have pretty much inaugurated the discourse by introducing the term the coloniality of power into the debate. And it's a remarkably complex and fascinating term. And like I said, stretches back to the late 1980s. And I think that was a kind of master key or a kind of real unlock for those scholars because it allowed them to see the world in a kind of new way. And I think even Walter Mignolo, who I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today, was enormously influenced by the work of Aníbal Quijano. And also, if I'm mistaken, I stand to correction on this one, but I think he did describe reading or coming across the term colonial matrix of power as a kind of epiphany or kind of epiphanic moment or something like this with respect to how the gears shifted and he's able to see the world in a new way. So I'm going to explain what the colonial matrix of power is in a moment. Other scholars who are associated with decoloniality theory, and now this starts gaining increasing traction globally speaking in the 1990s, would be this Argentine scholar of Italian descent, as he puts it. He's a semiotician, Walter Mignolo, and was for a long time a distinguished professor at Duke University. Also associated in the 90s with figures like Boaventura de Souza Santos, with Ramon Grosfoguel, with Nelson Maldonado-Torres, and various other protagonists as well. But throughout the 90s and early 2000s, most of these thinkers began progressively to become installed in the highly prestigious universities of the global north, especially in the United States. So I think that the United States is a critical transit point when one thinks about how decoloniality eventually traveled around the world. Because by 2015, when it was first arriving in full force on the shores of South African universities and also making its impacts in other places like Asia, it had crucially stopped in the United States. And that's where it gained an extraordinary amount of its intellectual prestige and power. What are some of the terms that are associated with decoloniality theory? The colonial matrix of power is, I would say, the organizing macro narrative of that theoretical apparatus. I would say that if you don't believe in the colonial matrix of power, I'm not sure whether you can really be a decoloniality theorist in the most serious sense of it. Other terms which are associated with it: epistemic delinking, epistemic reconstitution, border thinking, pluriversality, ecologies of knowledge, the colonial wound, and so on and so forth. It has a highly complex vocabulary of its own. And I also want to make clear that one of the things that troubled me so much about decoloniality when I first began to read it is that decoloniality theorists style themselves as they are the avatars or representatives of a grassroots movement, and they actually represent struggles that are coming from the base of society, from ordinary peoples in society. And it's simply their job to bring into the university space and into intellectual debates the types of thoughts that are being suppressed, that are happening at the lowest levels of society. But good heavens, if you try to make sense of this vocabulary, I mean, it's absolutely elitist, it's exclusive, it's so complicated. I have now this year spent hours and hours of my life with colleagues of mine trying to demystify and make sense of what some of these terms mean. And I promise you, some of them are strategically ambiguous. Because when they're ambiguous and you can hide behind that ambiguity, it becomes enormously productive in terms of defending yourself against people who are coming along and asking exactly what it is that you're up to. Okay, so I've said, yes, it emerges in the 1980s out of those sets of debates. It has its own particular conceptual apparatus associated with some of those words I've given you. It is associated with certain kinds of thinkers whose names I've mentioned. I've said that over the last 3 years, we've seen the way in which it first went to the United States of America and then was exported throughout the world. So that's what I mean by decoloniality theory.